I wasn't always the woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. In fact, for most of my life, I was the one people talked over, dismissed, or forgot entirely. I was the quiet one, the plain one, the responsible sister. A label slapped onto me so early it might as well have been engraved into my skin. My younger sister Rachel? She was the star. Blonde, charming, and blessed with that effortless magnetism that made teachers favor her, boys follow her, and even our own parents light up around her in ways they never did with me. Growing up in a small town where appearances and reputation were everything, the contrast between us wasn't just visible, it was a spectacle. Rachel was homecoming queen. I was in ROTC. She dated the captain of the football team. I was learning how to disassemble a rifle blindfolded. Our mother would beam proudly when Rachel twirled in a prom dress, but only ever sighed at my camo boots and buzz cut when I came back from summer training. "Couldn't you try to be a little softer?" she once whispered. Like my ambitions were an affliction she didn't want the neighbors to notice. But I didn't want soft. I wanted sharp. I wanted strength, independence, and the kind of confidence that didn't need validation from a man or a mirror. That desire led me straight into the military academy, a decision that earned me a tight-lipped nod from my father and an eye roll from Rachel. They said I was running away. I said I was finally running toward something. The years that followed were hard, grueling, relentless, and at times lonely. I climbed ranks slowly, each promotion paid for in sweat, sleepless nights, and fractured relationships. There were no shortcuts, no applause, and certainly no family visits. Not once did my parents show up at a pinning ceremony. Not once did Rachel call to ask how I was doing in Kandahar, or during my first deployment in Syria. The silence from them was loud enough to drown out the gunfire some nights. I remember one particular Christmas. I had just returned from an overseas mission, exhausted, burned out, but alive. I called home, hoping maybe this time they'd ask me to come. My mother answered. Her tone was clipped, distracted. "Oh, you're back? That's nice. Rachel's flying in from California with her fiancé. They're staying in the guest room, so we're kind of full. Maybe next year, honey." Then she hung up. "No, we miss you. No, thank you for your service. Not even a damn Merry Christmas." So I stopped calling. I stopped hoping. I focused on my career, on the mission, on building something that couldn't be taken from me or talked down by anyone, especially not my family. I earned a name, a reputation, and a position that most of the men I trained with never even dreamed of. And yet, in the eyes of my family, I was still the disappointment. The girl who ran off to play soldier, while Rachel built a picture-perfect life. What they didn't know, what they never cared to ask, was that while Rachel was busy chasing likes and engagement rings, I was commanding real operations, making decisions that saved lives, and rising through a system that didn't want to make room for someone like me. But I made room. I carved it out with grit and blood, and the kind of stubborn determination that didn't need applause to thrive. Still, despite everything I built, I never truly escaped the shadow they shoved me into. Until one day, fate handed me a moment so sharp, so deliciously poetic, that it sliced through every insult, every dismissal, every condescending glance I'd ever endured from them. And it all began with Rachel bringing her fiancé home for a family brunch. He wore a uniform too. And he knew exactly who I was. The brunch was supposed to be casual. That's how Rachel described it when she left me a chirpy voice message I almost deleted without listening to. "Hey big sis. Just wanted to let you know we're doing brunch at Mom and Dad's next Sunday. You should come. Greg would love to meet you. He's in the military too. You'll have so much in common." Her tone was sugar-coated, performative, like she was doing me a favor. It had been over a year since I'd spoken to her directly, and even longer since she last remembered I had a name other than the weird one. I debated ignoring the invitation altogether, but something about the way she said, "You'll have so much in common," made my stomach tighten. There was an edge to her voice, a smugness, as if she knew something I didn't, or thought she had finally one-upped me in my own domain. The Rachel I grew up with was always competitive, always calculating. If she was dating someone in uniform, it wasn't about shared values or deep respect. It was status. It was power by association. It was about how she'd look standing next to a man in dress blues. So I showed up. Not for her. Not for my parents. but because I'd spent my entire life letting them assume things about me. That I was lonely, bitter, unremarkable. I wanted to see their faces when they realized how wrong they were. I wore my uniform, polished and pressed. Medals shining, boots spotless. Not ostentatiously, just the standard dress. But when you've earned what I've earned, the standard speaks volumes. The moment I walked through the door, the room fell quiet. My father blinked like he didn't recognize me. My mother smiled with that tight, awkward expression she reserved for tax auditors and nosy neighbors. Rachel? She looked up from her mimosa and froze. Her fiancé, tall, broad-shouldered, freshly shaved, turned toward me with the casual ease of someone used to being the most important person in the room. Until he saw my rank. He stiffened instantly. His eyes locked on my insignia. A flicker of confusion passed over his face, followed by recognition. Then something I hadn't seen from a man in uniform in a long time. Respect. He straightened, set his glass down, and then, in front of my entire family, extended his hand with perfect posture, and said the words that would echo in my chest for days. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, "it's an honor. I didn't realize you were the general." The silence that followed was visceral. I watched Rachel's lips part in disbelief. My mother blinked once, twice, as if trying to compute what she'd just heard. My father gave a hollow chuckle, clearly thinking it was a joke. But it wasn't. Greg, Lieutenant Commander Gregory Parks of the United States Navy, stood at attention like a cadet in front of a superior. Because that's what I was. In that moment, everything shifted. They could no longer ignore me. Could no longer reduce me to the odd one. The loner. Or the one who left. Because there, standing before the golden child and her military fiancé, I was the one wearing stars on her shoulder. I was the highest-ranking person in the room. I was the one whose name would outlast theirs. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed their approval. I had become something far greater than they could ever comprehend. And they were just beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The aftermath of that brunch hung over my family like a storm cloud, refusing to drift away quietly. In the days that followed, I received no follow-up call, no acknowledgement, not even a passive-aggressive group text. Nothing. Just silence. Not the indifferent kind I had grown up with, but the sharp, crackling kind that hummed with tension. My mother didn't ask about my service, my deployments, or how I came to wear those stars. She didn't ask at all. Instead, she clung to her apron and made small talk about Rachel's upcoming bridal shower, as if the entire moment hadn't just detonated the foundation of her worldview. But I saw it in their eyes. I saw it in the way my father avoided making eye contact with me, retreating behind his newspaper like it was body armor. I saw it in Rachel's rigid posture, her carefully composed smile cracking at the edges. They were blindsided, humiliated, even. For all their years of comparison, judgment, and quiet condescension, they had never once considered that the daughter they deemed a disappointment could outrank their pride and joy's perfect catch. The reality of who I had become threatened the fragile hierarchy they had built around Rachel's success. And it terrified them. The next week, my mother called, not to congratulate me, but to ask me not to wear my uniform to Rachel's engagement party. "It's just a little much," she said, her voice tight with false cheer. "We don't want to make people uncomfortable. This is Rachel's day after all." I almost laughed. Uncomfortable? Was that what they felt? Seeing me fully for once? Seeing the woman I had become without the lens of their own insecurities? I could hear the panic bubbling beneath her words, the unspoken fear that I might overshadow her golden child again, just by existing. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. I simply said, I wasn't planning on going, and hung up. The truth was, I had no desire to attend an event built on the same shallow expectations that had once crushed me. But the deeper truth, the one I couldn't admit even to myself, was that her words hurt. After everything I had achieved, after every sacrifice, every bruise, every sleepless night and buried trauma, they still saw me as a threat, not a daughter. Then Rachel called. Unlike our mother, she didn't mince words. "Why didn't you tell me?" she snapped, her voice high and brittle. "You let me bring Greg in there without warning him. Do you know how embarrassed I was?" I paused. Then I asked, Why would you be embarrassed that your sister earned the rank of general? She scoffed. You know what I mean. You made me look stupid. You just sat there and let him gush over you like some damn groupie. You think this is funny? No, I said evenly. But it is enlightening. You've always been like this, she hissed. Acting like you're above everyone. Even now. You couldn't just let me have my moment. You had to steal it. That was when I realized what this was really about. Not Greg. Not the brunch. Not even the uniform. It was about control. Rachel had built her whole life around being the center of attention, the benchmark for success in our family. The day I walked into that room and reminded everyone of what I had become, something they couldn't measure in Instagram likes or engagement rings, it shattered the illusion she had curated so carefully. But instead of stepping back and reflecting, she came at me with venom. She was threatened, and like any cornered animal, she lashed out. You think you're so noble? She spat. You're not a hero. You're just cold. Alone. You don't even have a man. I let the insult hang in the air for a moment before answering. I don't need a man to validate me, Rachel. And unlike you, I didn't build my life waiting for someone else to hand it meaning. The line went dead. After that, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would settle. But they didn't. They got worse. Much worse. A few weeks later, I received a formal envelope in the mail, elegant cardstock, engraved lettering, the kind of thing that screamed performative wealth. Inside was Rachel's wedding invitation. Not a text, not a phone call, not even a personal note. Just a stiff piece of paper listing event times and dress codes. As if I were one of 100 distant acquaintances rather than her only sibling. But what stood out wasn't the invitation itself. It was the subtle but unmistakable omission. No mention of my rank, no title, just my name, printed as Miss Lillian Hart. Not general. Not colonel. Not even captain. Miss. It was a message. One more silent slap in the face. A way of rewriting the narrative she couldn't control, reducing me, again, to something palatable. Something quiet. Something forgettable. I placed the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. I wasn't surprised. But the sting of it still hit harder than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just erasure. It was punishment. For daring to step out of the mold. For reminding them that I didn't need their approval, and never had. A few days later, while grabbing coffee near base, I ran into Greg. He was alone. Off duty. Dressed in civilian clothes, but still standing with that rigid, trained posture. When he spotted me, he looked both cautious and relieved. Like he'd been hoping to see me but wasn't sure what he'd say if he did. General Hart, he greeted with a respectful nod. Commander Parks, I replied just as coolly. He hesitated, then sighed. Look, I wanted to apologize. For that brunch. For how it went down. I didn't know your family didn't appreciate your career. Or respect it. I shrugged. They never had to. I didn't do it for them. He nodded slowly, chewing the inside of his cheek. Rachel didn't tell me anything. Not about your service. Not about you at all, really. I feel like I walked into a completely different version of her life that day. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. This wasn't about him. But it was interesting to watch the cracks form, to see his curated vision of Rachel slowly unravel. She's been weird ever since, he continued. More defensive. More obsessed with appearances. I think she felt blindsided. Like she wasn't the star anymore. I looked him straight in the eyes. Maybe she never was. He didn't argue. The conversation drifted after that. Nothing flirtatious, just a strange mutual understanding. The kind of clarity that only comes when two people finally see the same truth. He was beginning to understand what I had known my whole life. Rachel wasn't built on strength. She was built on mirrors, smoke, and applause. Take away the audience, and there was nothing left. That was the last time I saw him before the wedding. And then just 3 days before the ceremony, I got the message that pushed everything over the edge. It was from my mother. We've decided to keep things simple. It read. Immediate family only at the front. There won't be a seat for you next to us. But you're still welcome to attend, of course. Just let us know if you'll be bringing a guest. No seat. No title. No place. I wasn't part of their narrative anymore. I was being written out of my own family. And something inside me, something I had kept buried for decades under discipline, resilience, and protocol, finally snapped. They wanted a simple wedding? I'd give them something unforgettable instead. I didn't RSVP to the wedding. I didn't need to. If they were going to treat me like an outsider, I would embrace the role with precision. Not with tantrums or emotional pleas, but with calculation. The kind of sharp, deliberate execution I'd mastered over years of strategic command. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, my absence for irrelevance. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake? Assuming I would play by their rules. The morning of the wedding arrived cloudless and hot. An aggressive July sun baking everything in gold. I dressed with practiced care. Crisp uniform, perfectly aligned medals, polished boots. Every detail screamed authority, power, legacy. I wasn't just walking into a wedding. I was walking into a battlefield, one where my weapons were presence, posture, and timing. The venue was predictably excessive. An overpriced estate on the edge of town, complete with wrought iron gates, sculpted hedges, and a staff dressed more formally than most embassy workers. The kind of place that reeked of curated perfection, designed for filtered Instagram posts and rented fantasy. I arrived 10 minutes before the ceremony. Not early enough to be seated by ushers. Not late enough to be denied entry. I walked straight past the guests lingering near the entry arch, past the whispers and double takes, past the stunned event coordinator stammering, "Excuse me, ma'am," as I moved toward the ceremony aisle. My eyes never broke focus. I spotted my mother first. Sitting second row, floral fascinator perched on her head like a crown, lips tight. Then my father, fidgeting with his cufflinks. Then Rachel, radiant in white, her posture porcelain stiff. Greg beside her with a look that could only be described as conflicted. I didn't stop to greet them. Instead, I approached the front rows, paused just long enough to scan the seating chart sign perched on an easel, then turned on my heel and made my way to the side. Not the front, not the back. Visible. Present. Uninvited. Unmovable. Whispers surged around me like wind. I saw Rachel's bridesmaids glancing nervously at each other, clearly unsure whether they should intervene or pretend not to notice. My mother, ever the actress, leaned toward my father with a forced smile, no doubt whispering damage control tactics through clenched teeth. The ceremony began. The officiant's words were a blur of generic sentiments. Rachel clutched Greg's hand like it was a prop. He in turn kept glancing toward me. He wasn't smiling. When the vows came, Rachel's voice trembled. Not with emotion, but with pressure. With fear. Her script, her picture-perfect moment, was cracking under the weight of my presence. She couldn't ignore me, no matter how tightly she held her bouquet. Her words, rehearsed and hollow, rang out across the manicured lawn. But they didn't land. They didn't resonate. Because the real story wasn't on the altar. It was standing off to the side in full dress uniform, arms crossed, watching her facade unravel. When Greg took his turn, his voice was steady but distant, detached. And as he reached the final line of his vows, "I promise to support you, to stand by you, and to build a life grounded in truth and respect." His eyes flicked to me. For a heartbeat, I thought he might stop. He didn't. But the silence that followed lingered too long. Long enough for everyone to feel it. The ceremony ended. Applause, hugs, the shuffle of bodies moving toward cocktail hour. I stayed where I was, watching. Greg approached me first. "I didn't know you'd come," he said under his breath. "I was told I wasn't welcome," I replied. That didn't stop me. He swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have to force your way into your own family's event." "No," I agreed. "But here we are." He hesitated, then said quietly, "You deserved a better seat." "I don't need a seat," I said, meeting his eyes. "I earned my place, whether they like it or not." And that's when he said it, the thing that changed everything. "You know, part of me thinks I married the wrong sister." Then he walked away. And I knew in that moment that the ceremony was over. But the real reckoning had only just begun. The reception unfolded under chandeliers strung between oak trees, a shimmering canopy meant to dazzle social media voyeurs. Yet every candlelit table, every curated flower arrangement, felt brittle now, as though one honest breath might splinter the entire tableau. I circulated at the edge of the gathering, absorbing the shifting currents. The way older relatives whispered once my back turned, the way former schoolmates, faces I half remembered from pep rallies I never attended, glanced at my insignia, then at Rachel, then back at me with dawning recognition that the family narrative they had swallowed for decades was a fiction. Rachel tried to keep the spotlight tethered to her smile. Yet that smile frayed each time Greg drifted toward me instead of her. He did not hover. He simply gravitated, the way a compass settles north, asking measured questions about deployment logistics, joint force strategy, the scars leadership etches into a person's quiet hours. Every answer I offered carved another fissure in Rachel's porcelain composure, because she understood that respect, once redirected, is almost impossible to reclaim. Midway through dinner, my mother cornered me beside the bar, her perfume a cloying mask over panic. Without preamble, she launched into a brittle apology, rehearsed bloodless, insisting the seating oversight had been an innocent mix-up, begging me to change into something less official before the photographer's golden hour shots. I listened, expression neutral, until she uttered the phrase, "for your sister's sake." That was the moment I realized they would never grasp the difference between celebrating one child and erasing another. Their love had always been a zero-sum ledger tilted toward Rachel's vanity projects. I walked away without answering, crossing the lawn toward the gift table where an unlocked card box overflowed with envelopes, cash, checks, promises. 2 college friends of Rachel's gushed about her meteoric rise at a lifestyle branding firm I knew had been funded almost entirely by our parents' silent loans. That hypocrisy might have simmered in me once. Tonight it crystallized into strategy. Because amid the chatter I overheard a detail that reoriented every slight. Our parents had refinanced their house 6 months earlier to cover the wedding's 6-figure spectacle, and the down payment on Rachel and Greg's planned condo in San Diego. Money siphoned from what had once been a jointly promised inheritance. They had mortgaged their future, gambled security they assumed I neither needed nor deserved, all to preserve the myth of Rachel's flawless ascent. Knowledge is a blade, and in my hands it does not stay sheathed for long. I slipped away to the catering tent, requested the lead coordinator, and in the calm, authoritative register that moves mountains in war zones, explained that the hosts were experiencing an unforeseen credit line complication. For liability reasons, I said, all outstanding balances must clear before dessert service. The coordinator, sympathetic yet firm, relayed the requirement to my father, whose face drained of color as swiftly as the open bar ceased pouring. Guests noticed, whispers thickened, champagne flutes lowered. While confusion spread, I approached the DJ booth with equal composure, providing a new playlist on a flash drive. A nod, a silent countdown, and the carefully curated soundtrack dissolved into a ceremonial march, one reserved for military change of command. Conversations froze. Every gaze swung to me. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. I stepped onto the dance floor grass, spine straight, metals glinting red-gold in the dying light, and raised a glass of water. No need for their borrowed sparkle. Without raising my voice, I thanked the crowd for honoring the union of Rachel and Gregory Parks, then recounted, fact by fact, the debts quietly accrued to manufacture the evening's illusion. The property leveraged, the future mortgaged, the inheritance diverted without consent. I spoke not with bitterness but with the precise cadence of an after-action briefing. Each sentence a mortar shell landing on decades of deceit. Gasps rippled outward. A bridesmaid burst into tears. Greg's posture sagged as truth detonated behind his eyes. Rachel's scream sliced the hush. But sound alone cannot stitch a collapsing narrative. She stormed toward me, dress gathering dirt, demanding I stop, that I leave, that I quit ruining everything. I met her fury with unmoving calm and said only, a foundation built on lies cannot bear the weight of a single fact. At that, Greg stepped between us, not to defend her, but to face me shoulders squared. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His silence indicted every half-truth he now understood she had fed him. Rachel's world tilted. Cameras flashed, not in celebration but in fascination with scandal. Sponsors, influencers, distant relatives. It no longer mattered who filled the seats. The story had already escaped the venue, viral in real time. And as staff wheeled away untouched towers of wedding cake, as power generators flickered off to save unpaid fuel costs, midnight approached with the inevitability of judgment. I watched my family scramble, my mother pleading with vendors, my father on the phone with a bank that had stopped answering, Rachel sobbing into a designer train that now resembled a wilted flag of surrender. Only then did I turn and leave, boots silent on gravel, stars on my shoulders catching the moonlight. Behind me lay a broken pageant. Ahead, the clear road of my own making. Yet retribution was not complete. The real reckoning, the one that would ensure they never rewrote my story again, waited beyond the estate gates, where leverage becomes law and signatures bleed consequences. Tonight I had merely pulled the pin. The explosion would follow at dawn. In the days that followed, silence fell over my family like ash after a fire. The kind of silence that clings to skin, seeps into walls, and turns memory brittle. No one reached out. No attempts to explain or apologize. Not even from Rachel. She had vanished into whatever damage control she could muster, probably scrambling to salvage her reputation online, deleting comments, untagging photos, spinning new versions of the truth. But facts don't bend for long. Not when they've been spoken aloud. I didn't revel in the destruction. That's not what this was about. But I'd spent my entire life being dismissed, undervalued, excluded from the very family that should have protected and supported me. And now, for once, they were forced to live with the version of reality they had always refused to acknowledge. That I wasn't disposable. I was dangerous. Still, I wasn't finished. The wedding had been the first domino, but the real vengeance would be quiet, slow-burning, and legal. Precise. I contacted a lawyer, not one of those loud billboard types, but a man with silver at his temples and a mind like a scalpel. I handed him everything. The details of my parents' refinancing, the promises they'd made about shared inheritance, the documentation of their liquidated assets, the quiet way they'd funneled wealth into Rachel's accounts for years under the guise of supporting her dreams. He nodded as he listened, saying very little. At the end of our meeting, he slid a thin folder across the table. "Everything you're alleging is provable," he said. "And if you're ready to pursue it, I can have letters of intent filed within the week." I signed without flinching. Let them try to ignore me now. What they didn't realize, what no one outside the military ever truly understands, is that revenge, when done properly, is indistinguishable from justice. It's not about outbursts or drama. It's about strategy. And I had studied tactics my entire adult life. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed to move through the system they thought would protect them, and bend it with the full weight of my accomplishments. The lawsuit hit harder than the wedding speech. My parents received the notice first. A formal demand for an accounting of all shared assets and a forensic audit of trust funds that had long since disappeared into Rachel's lifestyle branding company. I could imagine my father's face as he opened it. How the blood must have drained from his cheeks. How his fingers must have trembled. He had spent years convincing himself that what they did wasn't theft, just practical planning. But courts don't operate on sentiment. Then came the call from Rachel. I let it go to voicemail. The next day she sent an email. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an explanation. It was a tantrum in prose. Paragraphs about how I was tearing the family apart. About how money isn't everything. About how she had earned every penny by being the one they could count on emotionally. I forwarded it to my lawyer. Then I went to work. The military had taught me how to remain composed under pressure. But it had also taught me how to use pressure. How to exploit weaknesses, map defenses, dismantle systems from within. And in this case, the system was my family's house of cards. By the second week, bank statements started surfacing. My parents' credit had taken a dive after they defaulted on a payment to one of the wedding vendors. Rachel's condo purchase fell through after Greg, wisely, halted the escrow process. He was having second thoughts, and not just about the property. Word spread. Quietly at first. Friends of the family began distancing themselves. My parents' social club invitations got lost. Their church committee seats were reassigned for rotation. Not because I had exposed them publicly, I hadn't. But because truth has a way of leaking out, and people love to watch a pedestal crumble. Greg reached out again. This time I answered. We met in a public park. He wore civilian clothes, but his gait still carried the stiffness of someone trained to salute. He looked exhausted. I ended it, he said. I moved out. The wedding, it changed everything. Not just how I see Rachel, but how I see myself. I don't want to be part of something fake. I nodded. Takes courage to walk away. He exhaled, almost a laugh. I thought I was marrying into some glamorous story. Turns out I was just another chapter in her fantasy. I didn't offer sympathy. I wasn't there to comfort him. But before we parted, he looked at me and said, "They tried to hide you. Like you were the family's shame. But you're the only one who walks like she knows who she is." That stayed with me. Because it was true. They had tried to bury me. Now they were choking on the roots I'd grown in the dark. By the third week, the facade my parents had curated for over 3 decades began to implode in earnest. What had once been a well-kept illusion of upper-middle-class elegance, the holiday newsletters, the charity brunches, the hand-picked quotes about family unity, now rotted in plain view, exposed by filings, subpoenas, and the slow churn of legal gears they never thought would turn against them. And I remained silent, deliberate, untouchable. My lawyer worked efficiently. He discovered that not only had my parents rerouted funds that were meant for both children into Rachel's various ventures, but they had done so using joint estate accounts my name was legally attached to. Years of favoritism now had a paper trail, and in court, paper trumps nostalgia. The judge didn't take kindly to what he called manipulative asset redistribution. My parents' attempt to reclassify Rachel's condo loan as a gift fell apart the moment we presented the amortized debt against the original home equity withdrawal. Every lie they'd leaned on folded under scrutiny, not because they were malicious financial criminals, but because they had believed, genuinely, that I would never fight back. But I had finally decided that enough was enough. The court froze all disbursed assets related to the estate, including the $500,000 already funneled into Rachel's business and home. Suddenly, her Instagram-perfect life began to unravel with startling speed. The vendors she hadn't paid in full sued her directly. The sponsors that had promised brand deals ghosted her inbox. A video from the wedding leaked. Just a minute of audio, my toast over the military cadence, but it was enough to create a ripple of questions. People began to ask what kind of woman needed a 6-figure event funded by a home she didn't own. I didn't leak the video. But I wasn't sorry someone had. My mother, ever the master of appearances, tried to control the narrative through pity. She called a distant cousin, one of the few left who hadn't already distanced herself, and cried over the phone about how Lillian was always cold, always hard to love, how she just didn't understand family. But gossip is fickle currency. And this time, it didn't buy her the sympathy she craved. I started receiving emails from former classmates, colleagues of my parents, even some extended relatives I barely remembered. They told me the same thing, each in their own wording. "We didn't know. We're sorry. We see you now." I didn't need their apologies. But I read every word. Because seeing me now meant they hadn't before. At the height of it all, Rachel made one final, desperate move. She showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't let her in. But there was something in her eyes, not humility, not regret, but desperation, that made me open the door. She stood there in designer clothes that now looked out of place, like theater props under fluorescent lighting. Her makeup was immaculate, but her hands trembled. "You win," she said flatly. "Is that what you wanted?" I tilted my head. "You think this is about winning?" She pushed past me, uninvited, pacing my living room like she owned it, a habit she must have inherited from our mother. "Everything is gone," she hissed. "The condo, the business. I've got creditors calling me in the middle of the night. You ruined me." "No," I said. "You ruined yourself. I just turned the lights on." She stopped. "I was the one who stayed. I took care of them. I went to the birthdays and the holidays. I kept the family together." "By erasing me?" I asked, arms crossed. "By pretending I didn't exist unless it made you look better? You didn't keep the family together, Rachel. You built a stage. And when I didn't play the role, you rewrote the script." She stared at me like she didn't recognize who I was, like she had never really looked at me at all. Then her voice broke. "They loved me more." I didn't flinch. Yes. And they made you believe that made you better. But love built on lies isn't love. It's leverage. She left without another word. And I stood there, in the stillness of my own home, not triumphant, not vindicated, just free. For the first time in my life, I had forced them to see me, not through the fog of their preferences or their prejudice, but as I was, as I am. And now that they would never forget it. Autumn came early that year, and with it a quiet unlike any I had known before. The noise of the lawsuits, the headlines, the whispers, all of it had dulled, settling into a kind of permanent hush. Like a house after a long party, every room finally still, every surface coated in the aftertaste of truth. My parents had moved into a smaller home in the outskirts of town, one they could afford without refinancing or illusions. The estate they once bragged about at dinner parties now sat empty, awaiting foreclosure. I drove by it once. Not to gloat, not even to confirm it for myself. I suppose I wanted to see the emptiness, to witness what silence looks like when it's earned. The shutters were drawn, the grass was long, and the for sale sign leaned crooked in the yard. It looked nothing like the fortress I remembered as a child. It looked exactly like what it had always been, hollow. Rachel disappeared from the digital world entirely. Her business website redirected to a dead domain, her influencer profiles vanished, her phone number changed. She went underground in the most literal sense. No more weddings, no more filters, no more image to maintain. I knew from court filings that she had filed for personal bankruptcy. I didn't cheer, but I also didn't blink. Some people need to be reduced to ash before they remember what they're made of. As for Greg, he left the Navy quietly, 6 months after the wedding. We exchanged a few messages, brief, formal, respectful. I never asked why he walked away from Rachel. I didn't have to. He'd seen the truth, the whole of it, and once you've seen that, there's no going back to the pageant. I sometimes thought about what might have happened if they'd treated me differently. If my parents had celebrated both daughters. If Rachel had viewed me as an ally instead of a threat. If love hadn't been conditional, transactional, tied to obedience. But that's the kind of thinking that gets people stuck in ghost houses, chasing shadows that will never turn around. I had moved on. I poured myself into my work, not out of spite or distraction, but because I believed in it. Leadership isn't about control, it's about clarity. And clarity was something I'd earned the hard way. Every soldier I mentored, every mission I reviewed, I brought with me the lesson that even in the thickest bureaucracy, truth has a way of surviving. If you're willing to carry it like a weapon. One morning, 6 months to the day after the wedding, I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. An actual letter, handwritten, no return address. It was from Rachel. The paper was shaky, the handwriting unsteady. I used to think you were cold because you didn't cry. Now I understand you were surviving. You didn't fail us. We failed you. And I'm sorry I never said it sooner. There was no plea for forgiveness. No request to reconcile. Just that. Simple. Human. I sat with it for a long time. Then I placed it in a folder with my military citations and tucked it in the top drawer of my desk. Not to forget, but to remember. That even if apologies come late, they still matter. And that even in a battlefield called family, some victories are quiet. Some are letters. Some are the peace that comes when no one's watching. Time passed as it always does. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in small, deliberate steps. Leaves gave way to snow. The headlines faded. And so did the sharp edges of memory. Not the truth, not the facts, but the sting. The part of pain that once lived just beneath my skin had settled deeper, no longer raw, no longer ruling me. I didn't speak to my parents again. Not out of vengeance, but because there was nothing left to say. They had built a life where silence was safer than sincerity. And when the scaffolding finally fell, they chose shame over change. My mother had the chance to reach out. My father had the chance to look me in the eye. Neither did. They remained where they had always been. Trapped behind the stories they told themselves, unable to see the daughter who had stopped asking to be seen. But I didn't need them anymore. Closure doesn't always come in reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet moments alone. When you realize you no longer flinch at the thought of their names. When you can sit with the past, unguarded, and not feel it pulling you backward. When their absence feels less like a wound and more like a closed chapter. One Sunday, I walked the long path to the war memorial near base, something I hadn't done in years. I wore civilian clothes, nothing to mark my rank. I didn't want to be saluted that day. I wanted to remember the version of myself that once stood trembling in front of recruiters, desperate for a way out, for a life not measured by someone else's yardstick. That girl had been scared, but she'd chosen courage anyway. And that mattered. I sat on the edge of the stone bench and looked at the names etched into the wall. Some I knew, some I didn't. All of them reminders that strength isn't noise. It's persistence. It's choosing to stand, even when no one claps. Behind me, I heard footsteps. A woman and her daughter, maybe 10 or 11, walking slowly through the row of plaques. The girl glanced at me, eyes wide, as if she recognized something. Maybe the way I sat, or the expression I wore. "Mom," she whispered. "Is that lady a soldier?" The mother smiled gently. "She's more than that. She's a leader." The girl's eyes lingered on me for one more second before they moved on. I never turned around. I didn't need to, because they saw me, not the uniform. Me. And for the first time in a long, long while, that was enough.